All right. Okay, welcome back, rhetoric nerds, to another episode of Rhetorically Speaking, and I am your hostess with the mostest, Lee Pierce, she, they pronouns, bio, blah, blah, blah. All right, so I'm sitting in Wegmans, which, if you're not from the Northeast, is our super dope, extra fancy grocery store, regional grocery store. It's sort of like our extra fancy Publix, more like a Whole Foods, but anyway. And I don't watch the news. This seems strange for someone who is a political rhetorician and does political analysis, but it's ever since you know who got elected. It was depressing before. It's every day. I was watching Wanda Sykes' new stand-up last night, and she says that, you know how some people have resting bitch face? She said the election has given me resting what the fuck face, because you'll just be sitting there and watch the news going, what the fuck, right? And it's like permanent. That's very much how I feel. But I couldn't help but notice that, so the school shootings had happened, right? So just for, or not the school shootings, but the mass shootings. Is it, like these days you can't keep track of what kind they are. So, because when I was younger, it was only school shootings, right? When you heard somebody saying like a mass shooting had happened and it wasn't war related in some way, it was global conflict related, it was a school shooting. And now it's become one of those things where I still have that language seeped into my brain because that's what it was, but it has expanded so much, and for better or for worse, because I think we all think that when it's a school shooting, somehow we have more emotional attachment to it, which means it's better for gun control. But obviously, like as we've seen over the last 20 years, there's nothing about a mass shooting in a nightclub or a school shooting that creates any more emotional connection that will promote gun control, because I should talk about this in another episode, but we don't actually do things because of emotional appeal nearly as much as we think we do. It's more complicated than that, but I think we all over rely on the fact that like deeply felt and expressed emotion is somehow going to motivate people to action when they don't hold our belief system. So maybe I'll put that on the list for later. In any case, so what had happened is that there was the slaughter of 22 people in an El Paso shopping mall, and then 9 people were murdered in a Dayton nightlife district, both through, mass shootings, right, with guns. And this happened in early August. And so I'm in the coffee shop, and I knew what had happened. And so of course I was actively avoiding seeing what the president would say about it, because he's not in favor of gun control. And oh gosh, and I also have to do an analysis of the Obama did this really interesting thing when gun control wasn't passed. So I don't know if you remember, but Obama kept trying to get gun control passed, and it got defeated, I think, twice in the House. And then the third time, which he was coming up on the end of his tenure, so we knew there wasn't going to be another chance, it got defeated again. And he came out to the audience. He came out like, I'll have to find a video of it. I'll have to do another episode. Anyway, he cried. And I have a lot of strong feelings about that as a rhetorical choice. So, but I couldn't help it because there's a giant screen TV in Wegmans and I can't turn it off. So I'm typing away and I see at the bottom, I don't know if it's Mr. Trump or President Trump, I can't remember that part, says there is an appetite for gun control, right? So the president says there is an appetite for gun control. And this struck me as a really odd phrase. So I thought I would actually do today's episode on this word appetite in the context of this shooting. Because again, I think one of the things we have to be very careful when we do rhetorical analysis is that the use of appetite in this particular context is not going to necessarily then explain appetite in every single context. We always have to be closely reading the specific context in which a word is used. Now that doesn't mean that we won't see appetite showing or not showing up in similar ways, because the words tend to be culturally bound to some degree, and therefore they have a certain amount of longevity because they're serving certain purposes at certain times. And so if you start to notice them getting more traction, it probably means that they're doing some kind of work that people are tapping into because they see it work in one context, and either subliminally or consciously they pick it up and they start to use it. But it does mean that we can't always assume that, oh great, well I've solved appetite, so now if we ever see that word again, we'll know exactly what to say because I've already solved it. I wish it were that simple. No, that's not true. I'm glad it's not that simple. I'm glad that language is always moving around, but it does stabilize to some degree. So what'll be interesting is to see whether or not this repeats itself. So Trump says there's an appetite for gun control. And what's interesting about this is that in other contexts, I have heard him say there is no appetite for gun control. So it's a repetitive theme. And that's what I found so interesting about the word, is that it's doing work for him. And we always have to remember this. Like, yes, in all cases, words are just these things that we grab out of a bucket because we need them to express ourselves. And so we're just kind of grabbing them like a kitchen sink sort of dinner. But if we're choosing some words over others, which we have to do because he chose the word appetite as the word to name what is happening in public opinion right now about gun control, and he could have chosen a lot of other words. For example, he could have chosen there is a strong desire, because appetite literally means to desire. He could have chosen taste. There is a taste for gun control, because taste is another way that people say appetite. So for example, my grandmother would say, this does not suit my taste, which was which on her view was a more polite way of saying, this does not suit my appetite, but is less polite than saying something like, I'm sorry, I just have no appetite, which is different than saying I have no appetite for your food. So it's very complex, and it's not an accident, I think, that this word kind of shows up to describe this. So I just thought exploring this would be fascinating. So we have the two mass shootings, and they happen right next to each other. And of course, people who are in favor of gun control are, back at it, going really like, we're going to let this go again. This is the time to strike. And so there's a lot of activism around trying to use the momentum from the shootings to push gun control. And the president, who obviously has definitely made it very clear he's not going to pass gun control if he can help it, has to find a way to both. And he goes and he speaks to the families of these victims. I mean, this isn't like a one and done deal. He has to do the rhetorical work around these tragedies while also promoting gun control. It's a very interesting rhetorical situation. And he chooses this word. So he has to acknowledge. He can't just say, well, even with these shootings, I'm going to explain them away and we're still not going to pass gun control. Like, no way can he come out and say that. So he has to acknowledge that these things are tragedies. And then he has to acknowledge, like, yes, there is this movement now for more and more gun control, which I'm not going to pass. So he says, yes, I'm seeing an appetite for gun control. There's definitely, so he uses this word appetite as a way to acknowledge, because he can't just ignore it. He would look really dumb. And we think of Trump, at least I think of Trump, as being relatively stupid, but he understands the parameters of the rhetorical presidency. I mean, nobody can do that office and not, at least to some degree, pick up the fact that there are certain things that you can and cannot do. Because even though I agree that Trump pushed the parameters of appropriateness for the president so much further than any other president ever has, there is always a breaking point, right? And we never know it till somebody hits it. So I think specifically when John McCain, I'm sorry, not John McCain, he was the BIA guy. Damn it, what is his name? Howard Dean. So he made a presidential bid. I don't know that he would have won. I think he ran the year that Kerry wound up getting the nom, and he was doing really well, right? He was touring all the states. He was doing everything he was supposed to do, pounding the pavement, doing real grassroots stuff. And he gave this speech where he's really excited about it, and this and this and this and that. And then he's like, and then we're gonna go on, blah blah, and then we're gonna go Maryland, and then we're gonna go to Wisconsin, and then we're gonna march all the way into the White House. And then he kind of did this, yeah, yell. And then Dave Chappelle made fun of it, and the Dean scream, and it was hilarious. Tanked his presidential bid, right? So there is a breaking point, and Trump has it too. And what's interesting to me is that we think it's going to be the Mueller report or the Russians, and it's not. If there is a breaking point for him in the public world, it's going to be a rhetorical slip that just so violates norms that we did not even know we had for him. This is not that, right? The appetite is not that, but this is a moment where this could be the day where he just breaks the norm so badly that that his renom becomes endangered. But of course, what he's been really good at, I think, is pushing boundaries that we didn't know we had in ways that actually make him more attractive. And that's what's so problematic about him, is that his boundary pushing always seems to push him in the right direction. So norms of propriety don't undermine his presidential bid. That's not to say, though, that he just breaks every rule and people love it, because I don't think that that's true either, right? Rhetoric happens in an area of constraints. He just happens to be tapping into constraints that are easy to crumble and that actually open up more investment in his rhetorical performance, as opposed to somebody like Dean, who thought, right, he had energy, he was a charismatic person, he thought he had the nomination. And for some reason, and this would require, I think, a closer analysis than I can do right now, although I'll put it on the growing list of things I need to analyze, it hurt his bid, right? Because there was something about the way he broke that norm of decorum that made people kind of go. And I don't know if it was like the show of excess, if it was that he let his emotions sort of like, you sort of saw this emotional leakage of how excited he was. And maybe if at that time, that sort of raw intensity we didn't like being associated with our president, I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting question, but times also change. So what didn't work for Dean on the left seems to be working fine for Trump on the right. Although even Trump's shows of excess, I don't think, at least in the like nonverbal sense, I don't think show the same kind of break in expectation as Dean. So Trump says there's an appetite for gun control. So let's examine this word appetite. So I'm going to give you the etymology. So that's spelled, that's not entomology, which is the study of insects. Etymology is E-T-Y-M, etymology. And it's always cool to look at how words kind of integrate throughout history. And the other thing I'm going to introduce you to that I haven't discussed yet on the show is this really cool thing called the Google Ngram viewer, N-G-R-A-M viewer, which shows you word usage over time and where it is and where it's been, and you'll see peaks and valleys and stuff. And it usually does it between I think the 1800s when the records first started to be available all the way up until I think 2010, 2011, which is when they sort of stop. I don't know why you can't get an Ngram for the last year or two, but I've never been able to find one. All right. I think partially it's a cover your ass move by Google because they don't want to be responsible if someone uses them as evidence that a certain word has spiked in public culture, and then they're the source for that. I think that way if they're like, oh, well, our latest algorithms go back to 2010, they're always covered if you make a prediction based on something. But then again, it's Google. You can't tell me any data past 2010. Okay, anyway. So appetite comes from an Old English, Middle English, Old French word, appétit, right? A-P-P, I have to read this part, E with the little French dash, I forget what that thing's called, E-T-I-T. And of course, it looks like appetite, right? Appetit with no E. It's got two P's and no E, unlike the word appétit, which has one P and an E. It's appetit. And then that from the Latin appetitus, desire. So far, nothing surprising. It could also be from appetere, to seek after or to look for. So there's a desire for, there's a seeking after, right? There's a searching. Great. What's fascinating to me is a couple of things. One, the word appetit from the French looks almost exactly like petite, P-E-T-I-T, which is the French for small. So even though, as far as I can tell, they have no etymological relationship, right? There's no relationship between the word for small and the word for appetite. They don't somehow share some origin, which makes sense because in my head, I can't think of why the word appetite, a desire for, a seeking, would be related to small. But I don't know if that's true because if you think about how people use the word appetite, it's a gentle word. It's not a hunger for, it's not like a passionate burning for. It's kind of humble, right? It's sort of small. It's like a sort of petite desire in a way. I have an appetite for this. I have no appetite for that. Oh, I can sense that there's a certain sense of appetite in the air. So there's a way in which it is kind of tiny. So in that sense, that word is useful for Trump to have taken up in the public imaginary, right? It's useful for people who are anti-gun control because it suggests, it acknowledges that there is a desire for gun control without using a word like desire. Appetite, whether or not you know all of this etymology or whether or not you're just kind of a person who knows English and has rudimentary understandings, it puts that word petite in your brain. Oh, I see there's an appetite for me to change grades. I see there's an appetite for us to get out early today, right? It acknowledges your need. It acknowledges that there's a reality in the air, right? Because he has to find a way to do that. While also putting that word petite in your brain. And of course, petite it's a fancy French word, but we also see it all the time when we think about oh, she's petite or they're petite or petite clothing lines. So it simultaneously acknowledges the desire, but names it with a word that puts that word petite in the back of your mind. So it's almost as if by saying the word appetite, he's saying there's a petite desire, meaning there's a small desire. There's a tiny movement. There's a sense, but he can't say that stuff, right? He can't come out and go, I sense there's like a tiny desire, right? That would be totally diminutive. And it would, I think this situation is too fragile and gun control is going to be a tipping point, I think, for the 2020 election. He's going to have to be very careful about how he navigates that. Now, Clinton did not run on gun control. She could have. I mean, she very clearly, when Obama came out of office in 2016 and had not been able to pass gun control legislation, there was a very strong sense that she could win on gun control. I think she knew she couldn't. So what she did is she ran basically on just like the old Clinton policy, which was the assault rifle ban, but she never campaigned on it. That's just sort of part of her policy. But it didn't work because she actually just sort of left it implicit and didn't acknowledge it. You really can't do that. When something is this much in the ether and people are this concerned about it, it isn't something you can just come out and not acknowledge. So Trump can't ever stand up and be like, oh, well, I'm just not going to acknowledge gun control. I'm not going to talk about it, especially in the wake of these shootings, right? So the appetite for gun control is a petite desire. So he gets to acknowledge while diminishing, right, making it diminutive at the same time. So it's pretty clever, pretty, I think, and no wonder it keeps getting repeated. And previously to this, which I found is, he had said there was no appetite for gun control among the politicians. And I found that very fascinating, because that one I found interesting, to say there was no appetite. But again, I think it's the same thing, because an appetite is a collective sense. So instead of saying, oh, there's no desire for gun control among politicians, which seems factually inaccurate for some reason, because we know there are politicians who are campaigning specifically on gun control. When you say, oh, there's no appetite for gun control in the politics, what he means is it's not the trend of the day. So he's still right in the sense that he determines what the trend is. I mean, the trend is, you can't say any specific person doesn't have a desire for gun control, because the minute someone says, no, I want gun control, you're wrong. But if you're like, oh, collectively, I just don't get the sense that there's this appetite for gun control, you're correct, not because you're accurately describing reality, but because he's chosen to say it's not true. And therefore it's not true, because the whole point of the presidency is he controls the rhetorical trajectory. This is why this is why it's so important to vote for someone who is so good with language. It is about the policies, don't get me wrong. I have certain political choices that I make, but if you're not sure, I would always rather have someone who is careful, creative, and purposeful in their language, because they control the rhetorical mindset of the country. And that's why for the president, it's less about, really, ultimately, like legislation. Yes, he appoints Supreme Court judges. That's super important. That's terrifyingly important. He also, to some degree, he can veto things. But really, in terms of the law passing, there's so much beyond him. That both means he can and cannot get certain laws passed. Yes, through executive order, but even that, it's fleeting, right? Look how many executive orders Obama passed, and they now just crumble, and it becomes a huge amount of work for a Band-Aid solution because they're not written into law. But he controls the rhetorical tone of the country. Not entirely, right? But it's just such an important job, and we gave it to somebody who just is not thoughtful and careful with their language. And to some degree, that's precisely why he got elected. But to another degree, you can do both, right? You can be careful and creative with your language and also be exciting and stimulating and thrilling and violate social boundaries that people find artificial and stifling, without just throwing everything out the window to the point where your language becomes very erratic and unpredictable and stressful, I find. And not all that inspiring or creative or clever. But appetite is one of those moments where you can sort of see the linguistic craft of the rhetorical presidency at work. And what's cool about appetite, though, here's what I think is lovely, too. His choice of appetite doesn't control the conversation, because appetite has slippage. All words do. And what we mean by that is, yes, appetite has this baggage, this rhetorical baggage of the small and the diminutive and the tiny. But it's also got other kinds of baggage, like the hunger and the need and the desire, like when we think of Guns N' Roses' appetite for destruction, right? But it's not, but here's the problem. That word is old. So the baggage from this word, right, that means sort of like hunger and desire and passion, it's outdated. And this is where the Google Ngram comes in. So the Ngram viewer, and you can just type in Google Ngram, Ngram viewer. You also get it, I think, if you search a word and then the word etymology. So if I type in appetite etymology into Google, I think the Ngram just automatically comes up. But I looked it up, and so the word pretty much is pretty high. It's a relatively, when we think about it, like a kind of a classic outdated word. You don't hear a lot of people say the word appetite. Even when people don't even say I have appetite, they just say I'm hungry, I'm not hungry. And I think that actually in some ways speaks to our processed food culture, because we no longer think of ourselves as having appetites for certain foods. We use words like craving, and we use words like I'm hungry. And that sort of speaks to the fact that we have lost touch with the nuance of flavors in food. We either need to feed the body or we don't need to feed the body. Kind of what goes into it is not as important, which is what you mean when you say I have an appetite. You mean I want to taste something, right? I have an appetite. And you usually have an appetite for something. Although some people will describe people as oh, they have a big appetite. But that's because, I think in some ways, that's because we don't have another word for that, right? They have a big hunger. That's a weird adjective. So appetite, I think, has stuck around for that reason. But you see it dip pretty rapidly after 1900, and it hit like an all-time low in maybe like the 1950s, 1960s, and then it stays relatively steady. And then, of course, I imagine if the Ngram viewer were current today, you'd see a big spike because we've seen appetite suddenly show up. But in some ways, Trump is yanking kind of an old word, appetite. Because appetite used to have a lot of sophistication and nuance around it. You didn't just want or not want. You had taste and thought and cultivation. And you also had like hunger and eagerness and desire. And so in some ways, appetite, because of its connection to petite and like the fact it's kind of an outused word, undermines the demand for gun control. But in some ways, it actually acknowledges and emboldens it because he's saying people want it. There's a very thoughtful desire to have it. The problem is that collectively, I don't think we think about our language carefully enough. The petite is going to trump. Oh my God, I hate that word. There was a really good John Oliver about how instead of saying Trump, we should call him Drumpf, because the word Trump is already associated in our vocabulary as triumph. And so his last name already sort of does certain rhetorical work for him. But in fact, he came over with the original name before it was changed of Drumpf. And it's like Make America Drumpf, or Make America Great Again, vote Donald Drumpf. It's really clever. And he actually, I think for a while he had this program where you could get your browser to change every time you saw Trump into Drumpf, because he thought it would take the rhetorical energy out of his name, which I really agree with. I mean, I think that this is something we don't do enough with, like the issue of the proper name. So anyway, the petite winds up winning our interpretive battle in our brains over sort of the appetite, right? The eagerness and the desire so by him using that word, I think there is potential in that word, as there is in all words, to be taken in our particular rhetorical direction, right? So when I say our, I mean the opposite of how Trump's going to use it. So in this case, pro-gun control. But because the common association, I think the thing that sort of immediately pops into our head, because it isn't a word that we hear a lot or think about a lot, is the small. And so in that sense, he won that rhetorical battle, even though I think you could redeploy appetite. If somebody, like a clever gun control legislator right now who was anti-gun control, somebody in Congress, I would redeploy appetite to my benefit. That's how I would sort of counter this move. And there's always the question of like, oh, is now Trump just some linguistic genius? We're at 20 minutes. I like to keep these relatively short, but at some point maybe I'll do an episode about like intentionality versus effect, because I'm not going to say Trump's a linguistic genius. I don't think he sat down and thought very carefully about appetite. But if you spend enough time thinking about language, not carefully, but just you are a person who has to pay attention to your words, which Trump just is, whether or not you think he does or not, he does. I mean, it's just factually true. He has to choose some words over another, and he speaks a lot. This stuff just kind of seeps into your subconscious, like it's in the ether, and you pick up tidbits along the way. And I think, yes, he probably somewhere along the way or was advised to use the word appetite. Do I think he used it with all of the thoughts in mind that I have now? No, I don't think so, because if he had thought about it all, I don't think he would have chosen the word appetite, because I think there are ways to do what appetite does for him in the sense of diminishing the public without introducing the energy and the drive behind the word appetite as like a tasteful desire that is strong. So we can talk more about this later. This is always the question, well, like, did he mean it? Because people essentially want me to either validate Trump as some linguistic genius or say that he's a deranged lunatic who just like spouts off nonsense. But the truth is just never that simple. And those two opposing oppositions just do not at all speak to the fact that that whether or not you want to take Trump seriously, right? Language matters. He has figured out how to use it. I don't, in the ether, somehow it has happened to him. And it's careful, measured analysis of specific word choices and then counter launching campaigns with that language that almost always